Hey, my name is Matt, and today we're going to talk about the future of technology for indie game developers. Big topic, right? Well, it shouldn't be much of a surprise that everyone has been concerned with game engines ever since the Unity debacle of 2023, and I'm personally affected by these changes because I used Unity. Nearly a year later, I still haven't made the jump to a different engine. Now, I realize this is a hot topic, and might even be a little controversial, so let me just say up front that what Unity pulled last year was undoubtedly wrong and felt like a betrayal on multiple levels. I don't always support their decisions or their leadership, but at the same time their product is what allowed me to create all of my games that are currently up on Steam. So in that sense, I think for this video, it's fair to take a step back from all that, and look at things from a development perspective and talk more about the engine itself rather than the company running it. I also want to preface that I do fully support the mission of Godot, and want this engine to succeed. We'll get more into that later, but I just wanted to be extra clear here that I'm very excited about the future of the Godot engine, and the purpose of me talking about this stuff isn't to bash it or to say that it's terrible, it's to help improve the technology for everyone. I'm going to discuss areas of Godot that I feel have a ways to go, and when I do I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't use the engine, I'm just trying to highlight areas that I personally feel need to be looked at as development on it continues. Lastly, this is not just a behind-the-scenes video meant to give you insight on the tools I work with. This is partly for me so that I can better understand my own preferences and what I need to personally work on to reach the workflow goals that I want to achieve. So in that sense, it's going to be a little subjective, and my own anxieties about the future of my work tend to drive some of my concerns. But I will do my best to explain why I've been thinking about this so much, and hopefully you find that interesting too. Let's start with a question. Why try to leave Unity if it's worked for my games so far? For me, there are two reasons. The first is that Unity won't always be free. If I reach a certain threshold in sales and find success using their engine, they will ask that you upgrade your Unity plan to paid, or for more recent versions, charge per install with a cap at 2.5% of your revenue. Now, besides the previously uncapped install fee, which I found pretty atrocious, most iterations of this payment aren't really worth considering at all, because if you're making enough to trigger these fees, you can probably afford to pay them. But in the long run, it is weird that the game dev community hasn't really had a good engine option that is completely free, especially when you consider that we're the ones who are actually building this technology for ourselves. Ultimately, being liberated from having to worry about sales metrics or fees, in any capacity, at least frees up some of the mental strain. And that can be a huge deal for people that are already sacrificing a ton of time and money to build games. The second and more important reason I want to switch is being able to fix problems myself. With big closed source engines like Unity, you are limited by the fact that you rely on external engine developers to parse your bug reports and get back to you when something is broken. This can result in either a lot of waiting or a lot of confusion when things get really bad in your project. Even worse is when both parties have confirmed a bug exists, and you know it'll be a major concern when your game is deployed, but Unity just decides that they won't be fixing it for whatever reason. And this has personally happened to me multiple times. Some of my games are still at risk of facing certain editor issues even to this day. If I was just able to see and modify the source code of the engine I use, with the right knowledge I could understand and even fix issues myself, and propagate those fixes to the rest of the community, for the benefit of everyone building games with it. This is where open source engines come in. With open source software, you're both free to edit, modify, and distribute code that builds the program you want to use. It is the perfect option for someone in my position who wants to be free from the corporate limitations of commercial software while also being free and accessible. There are some good options out there which I highly recommend you check out, but today we're of course going to be talking about Godot. I really desperately wanted Godot to be the solution to my tech crisis because it is built by people who are passionate about making games. It has a big feature set and it's highly popular with game devs nowadays, which means there are plenty of resources for learning and support. So I did what any sane person would do and decided to dive straight into the C++ source code. Before you think I've lost my mind, my reasoning was pretty simple. If I could wrap my head around the way the engine itself is structured and just get a basic familiarity with the source code, it would mean I could get a head start in fixing any issues I come across while trying to use the Godot editor. This process actually went quite well, all things considered. There was a big hurdle setting everything up to be able to build the engine and a giant mess of a file structure to search through. But once I started to read through the logic, the overall idea began to click. At the same time, I was learning how to use the basic functionality of Godot by coding scripts and trying to replicate my workflow, but this is where the problems began. I want to highlight that I totally understand there being differences in workflow when moving to a new engine, but some of the issues I'm going to talk about are being brought up not because they're different from what I'm used to, but that they aren't scalable in the same way that they are in other engines. In other words, I don't care so much that I have to learn new ways of doing things in Godot, but I do care about those new ways being significantly inefficient in terms of development time, because that is extremely precious to me. Also, at the time of writing, Godot 4.3 just recently released with a ton of great improvements, and Godot 4.4 is already fixing up a ton of little annoyances. So it may very well be the case that, in the future, this video will be completely outdated, with all the problems I list totally solved. If that happens, great. That's exactly why I want to talk about these problems. It's so that they can be addressed with future Godot updates. So with all that said, here are the exact issues I came across that are currently preventing me from changing engines. My experience importing 3D animations into Godot has been nothing short of abysmal. Let's start with how I'm typically used to this process in Unity. When you import a 3D model into Unity that has animations tied to it, you get to configure the settings for each animation and set up a retargeting scheme on your characters so that you can share animations between them. Then, the animations that you've configured will show up in your assets. You can think of them as sub-resources that are bound to the 3D file, but still accessible by components and scripts. When I need to use an animation from one character on another character using the canon, which is Unity's current recommended workflow, I simply drag it from the assets into my animation graph and I can start creating transitions. I find this pretty intuitive, but let's try to accomplish the same thing in Godot. In Godot, you also get to configure animations on each of your files and set up retargeting schemes, which is great. But the animations are intrinsically tied to that exact model file's animation player node. So if I have another character that uses what is called an inherited scene, basically a way for me to customize the group of model objects before they're used in the game, I need to figure out how to get the other animations into this model's animation player. Alright, so let's start by opening up this Manage Animations window and hitting the Load Library button. Then select the 3D file that has the animations we want. Oh, some animation library files were invalid. I see, this is because we can only import animation library type files, so I'll have to create one first. Let's go to our second character, create another inherited scene so we can work with it more easily, and open up the animation window again. Let's use Save As and... oh, I guess we'll have to make it unique first. Alright, let's make it unique, which will create a copy of the data so that Godot can work with it instead of it being sourced from an external file. I feel like this will have bad consequences, but we'll just continue on for now. Save it as a new animation library, then go back to our first character and load that library. Finally, we can see the animation in our list, but wait, I forgot a step. It seems like I didn't set up retargeting on my second character, so we're not seeing any sort of motion on our first character in the scene view, even though the animations are correctly in the animation player list. Alright, let's go back to the import step for our second character and add retargeting info. Well, it seems like that didn't do anything. Whether through using inherited scenes or through making animations unique, it seems as though our existing scene just can't handle the new setup and now refuses to play the animation. I might be able to fix it through clever copy pasting, but ultimately it is easiest to just make a new inherited scene and look at that. We actually have a working animation. Well, that was pretty annoying, but at least it's done now, right? Wrong. Let's say I make a change to one of these animations, which is quite common when you're still developing, and I want to import that change into Godot. In Unity, I simply have to save the file, and the new data will propagate as expected. In Godot, because I had to make the animations unique, their data is not updated when I simply save a Blender file and re-import. I guess this means I have to do all of this again every time an animation changes? I mean, technically, all I have to do is resave the animation library, but the original inherited scene I used for my second character is now completely out of date because its animations are unique. It seems like the only solution is to make a new inherited scene, export the library again, and replace all previous instances of the last scene with the new one somehow. This is completely ridiculous, and I don't understand why it has to be this way. It seems that 3D import in general has just been left in the dust, and while there are some proposals to improve it in different ways, there's no getting around the fact that currently in 4.3, you have to jump through a lot of hoops to achieve a reasonable import method. In researching this, I have seen some people talking about creating editor extensions that automatically create libraries or manage animations on reimport, but when you ask a user to put in extra dev time on top of everything else that comes with game development, stuff like this becomes extra frustrating. Now, all of that was based on tutorial resources, which recommend that approach to importing animations. And there are quite a few that go that route and just ignore the problem of being able to edit your animations after the fact. But there is a better way. If you use this option, you can save imported animations to disk and add them individually as an animation player. Not only that, but these resource animations are also automatically updated when you save your Blender file. So great, this is a way to at least keep the workflow scalable without going through a million steps every time something changes. But is it? The main concern is, why is it so easy to get it completely wrong? Why is there so much emphasis both in the user interface and in online resources about exporting libraries and saving unique animations? And 3D games almost always want the automatic update approach that I discovered last minute. This whole system could be a lot clearer and less prone to mistakes if the engine encouraged this approach, rather than encouraging animations to become unique resources that never change. In fact, even when you try to use this save-to-disk approach, you hit a bit of a snag anyways, because you have to manually specify the location of each animation you want to save to disk. This isn't nearly as bad as having to pre-save an animation library, but it will add up if you bulk import dozens of animations at a time, like I tend to do. And who knows what will happen if you move or rename files with this sort of setup. There is yet another method to consider, which is to import the 3D file as an animation library itself, which has its own complications and downsides, but this section is already dragged on far too long. I think you get the point that this animation system is a bit confusing and convoluted for 3D users specifically, and I really hope improvements can be made in this area. If it wasn't for the research I did to make this video, I don't know if I would have had any sort of reasonable method for dealing with animations, but there is still a long way to go. For example, even using this method, changing import settings still has the possibility to brick your inherited scene, as I demonstrated earlier. If there is some specific user error reason as to why the rig breaks here, it's not clear to me in the UI at all. Here are a few more minor gripes. These giant lists can become a hassle if you manage dozens of animations per character. There really needs some sort of search or submenu feature, or this might not be scalable. It would also be nice to just be able to drag and drop animations into the player rather than always digging through files to get there. Finally, if this saving an animation to a file method is going to be the recommended workflow, we could really use a button that automatically configures all of the animations in a file to be saved with a name and placed in a subfolder so there is less manual labor involved. Hey, Feature Man here. So while recording footage for this section which you just saw, I also noticed that there was this button at the top which lets you export all of the animations in a blend file at once, and this is really good. I never noticed this before, so that's that problem solved. Unfortunately, while I was recording, I also encountered a lot of stuttering and new issues. Even knowing what I do now about the animation system, I ended up bricking my scenes again because I made a mistake while importing. So the footage that you saw was not exactly the scenario that I wrote out in the script, because it ended up just being too frustrating to go back and replicate all of those steps. And part of the reason for this is because there's a stuttering every time I switch tabs. Take a look at this. This is in real time how long it takes to move to the other scene tab. And I know that part of that is because there's issues and errors on the animation tracks that I'm using here, and this file is old and not optimized. It still seems like something is wrong though, like there's some sort of bug with the import system. I know there's things being fixed in the import system right now, and ultimately it just doesn't feel right every time I go back and forth and I'm waiting many seconds to actually get into doing stuff again. Godot also crashed 3 times while I was recording, and it's not that big of a deal because it seems like the work that I was doing still went through it's just very unstable at the moment, and I couldn't deal with it anymore, so it just wasn't a very fun time to try and figure out what all of those issues were. That's why you got the footage that you got. So that's all from my end, and we'll go back to the past, where I continue talking about the import system. As you can see from these examples, I believe 3D animation and file import is a huge pain currently and needs some attention to compete with other engines. This is going to sound like heresy, but being restricted to only one script per node makes things a little more tough to work with than they should be. Now, I know the reason why it works this way, and I appreciate the simple structure that this kind of decision provides in theory, but take a look at what happens to the hierarchy of a complicated entity that exists in the game, and compare that to a complicated entity in Unity's hierarchy. You might think, what's the problem? And you're right that maybe this is a result of preferences and muscle memory that have built up using a specific technology. But the consequences of requiring children nodes to become data points goes beyond just needing extra clicks to navigate the entity's behavior. As a side note, the extra clicks do impact the speed of editing properties, and that's not something I'm super fond of either. When people talk about this stuff, you usually hear the word composition brought up, and it's true that splitting scripts by their specific functionality pushes you to reduce coupling between systems. However, I don't often see it brought up that this is also possible in Unity, just with the added bonus of not needing to clutter up the hierarchy to accomplish it. Say for example, we have a character script that handles movement and a health script that handles destruction of a character. Specifically, it is able to disable visibility of the character when it has been defeated. In Unity, we can stack both of these on the parent object that holds everything about the character, and this allows us to move this object and disable its visibility. But in Godot, we must either choose one to belong to the parent object or have both scripts be attached to children objects. Either way, we are now forced to access some parent object on at least one of these scripts if we want to change one of its properties like its position or visibility status. Now you might say, so what? Well, for smaller projects, it's not a huge deal to figure out which objects you need to modify and traverse the tree through scripting to find them. For larger complicated projects, adding additional steps to anything in your workflow starts to add up. And when the engine's performance is directly affected by a number of nodes, it also makes sense to keep things minimal. Beyond the simple fact that managing more nodes in your hierarchy adds additional time when you're clicking through your game, having to consider and write code that reaches beyond the current object just because of this one script per node limitation can also be a pain in certain situations. The scenario I mentioned earlier is just a simple case, but it gets even worse if you have dependencies on other scripts. And knowing the types of games I build now, I can definitely foresee a lot of hassle if I try to organize my code in the same way. Granted, most of this boils down to a nitpick that can be worked around with enough patience, but again, it's something that affects the scalability of building games with the engine, and that's why I'm bringing up the concern here. So what exactly is the solution? Well, actually, I don't necessarily want to force the idea that Godot should have multiple scripts per node, because I do appreciate that core design. I also know it would be quite difficult to change when so many assumptions have likely already been made in the engine codebase about that. However, I do think it should be easier to build your own types of nodes and extend them in such a way that this kind of workflow is possible. Imagine if you had the power to build your own component system and customize the editor GUI to suit the needs of your exact game, or work generically, being able to plug in scripts as properties of a node. Editor extensions are currently possible, but I believe certain limitations prevent you from going this route in such a way that you keep the hierarchy clean while utilizing multiple scripts. So as an alternative to that, it would be great to have some organizational features that listed subnodes within a node, or allowed you to tag nodes to become smaller and change their color so that the components are easier to spot while working. Any sort of feature that enables users to more cleanly use nodes that only exist to hold a script would be an improvement here. I think either of these options would fit perfectly within Godot's philosophy and enable users to create complex games without spending as much time managing the scene tree. I love C#, and that is definitely a bias I have coming from Unity. Godot supports C# and I really appreciate that aspect, but there are some issues with the way you use C# in the engine that are kind of tough to adapt to. For one, there is no auto-reload, so if you edit a C# script in an external program like Visual Studio, you have to click a button to compile in order to see the changes reflected in the editor. This alone adds a lot of overhead time when you're working with the engine, but there's a few other issues that stop you from using C# the way you would in Unity. As many people already know, web export isn't available if you use C# code in your project. It's not a deal breaker for me since I don't typically build for the web, but I know a lot of people that have been pretty bummed about this. What's more crucial for me is the fact that not all C# types are serialized within the inspector UI. This probably has more to do with the way Godot's editor works rather than a specific C# issue. But if you create a struct or subclass within your C# script, it's not possible to see or edit those fields in a scene. This is a huge downside by comparison to Unity, which supports this, and even allows nested classes up to a certain limit. This means you are forced to leave editable properties ungrouped, and you're unable to create scalable data structures within the inspector. So if you wanted to build a list of audio clips that each had a name and volume level, you'd be forced to do so outside of the inspector, either with resources or some auto-loading system. If you've only ever used resources for this purpose, I can understand why you might not care about being able to edit groups of data in the inspector. Godot's resource system is a valuable tool that offers a lot of power to a developer trying to manage datasets. But for some purposes, like say a featured chessboard, where maybe you need to keep dozens of different datasets relating to different game mechanics that are all piped in through GameState, it can get really tedious to use resources for that. For one, each resource needs its own script file, and if you only need a few pieces of data within an element, you can seriously bloat up your project files. Again, this might not sound like a huge deal on the surface, but on the scale of a full 3D game with multiple gameplay modes, it can add up to hundreds of scripts just holding resource data. I think improvements to C# are on the way, or at least proposed and highly popular, but as it stands now I just can't code the same way I did in Unity. That's not inherently bad, but I like the way I was able to do things there by simply utilizing subclasses as groups of data, which can easily be passed around and exposed in my scene for easy editing. Enabling this sort of workflow by allowing custom types to show in the inspector should fit with Godot's intent to make life as easy as possible for programmers, while giving them customization over the data types that they want to work with. Okay, so this is a bit of a hot topic and one that has been highly debated for quite some time. Let's first clarify what I'm talking about. When I say live scene editing, I mean being able to view the running game through the editor and manipulate objects in the same way that I would when the game is not running, having them reflect the changes in real time. This is similar to how Unity and Unreal handles running the game. You're able to just directly click on something while it's moving and set its properties via the inspector. Godot can't do this, and there are valid reasons why it can't do this. However, they ultimately amount to not diverting enough effort into ensuring it works smoothly, or even at all. I understand why there's more attention on other parts of the engine currently, but I think I speak for most Unity refugees that this is one of the most important features that Unity provides over Godot right now. If you're interested, there has been tons of discussion about how exactly we can accomplish this in these GitHub proposals. There are a few ideas that have potential, notably either instancing the game inside of the editor, running the scripts in tool mode with physics enabled, or creating a remote version of the scene that updates based on change signals. But here I want to talk about why this feature is important rather than the implementation details. Assuming we can implement such a feature without side effects would greatly benefit the debugging process in multiple ways. For one, procedural tools that are generated at runtime can be previewed more easily when viewed through the editor, rather than relying solely on debug tools that you build into the game or through the somewhat lacking remote tab. Don't get me wrong, runtime tools are important, but when there's an automatic requirement to spend extra time building these tools, it can complicate what might otherwise be a simple project if you had used Unity. And this isn't just a benefit for procedural levels, it's also a plus for levels with multiple overlapping objects that are activated via story sequencing if you want to test out different sections of your game. And it's a plus for prototyping features in a sandbox environment, like maybe moving a floor up and down to test the behavior of runtime IK systems, or moving a collision object to test real-time cloth. Debugging becomes a whole lot easier and more straightforward when you use the same tools during play and development. I don't even care about these changes being kept after the game is done. I just want to be able to take a closer look at the state of the game from the 3D viewport, manipulate properties to simulate certain situations, and more easily view how the logic affects values in the inspector without digging through the remote tab. Again, this should line up perfectly with Godot's mission to make the game creation process easier, especially if it was added as an option that doesn't mess with the way it currently works. Implementation challenges aside, even a simplistic start to this feature would draw in a huge number of people and be a huge help for beginners and experts alike. That's why I believe it is worth pursuing at a very high priority. Hey, Future Matt again. So while I was editing this video, a pull request came in for runtime debugging tools and a embedded game window. So this accomplishes nearly the same thing that I was just talking about before. It just goes about it through the perspective of adding editor tools to the built game rather than trying to run the game within the scene that's in the editor. And there are downsides and upsides to this, but ultimately I think this is a step in the right direction. I think it's going to help a lot. There's a lot of features that I kind of want out of this for it to be really useful, such as maybe having two sub-windows, one that's playing the game, one for editing, disassociating the pause from the edit mode, translation features and stuff like that, stability. All that stuff could make the workflow a lot more comparable to Unity. So I'm going to hope that we head in that direction, and I'm also going to do my best to contribute code to this effort when I can. And I think this is a much needed feature, and I'm really glad that we're getting it now. I never really expected to see it this early, this soon. So hopefully soon we will actually see some movement, and this will solve pretty much one of the biggest problems that I have with Godot right now. And that's really great, and I want to thank the pull request authors who have been working on this. It's really great work, and I know a lot of people are going to be excited about this. So thank you so much, and we'll get on to the next subject. Believe me when I say this has just been a handful of the most pressing issues I've noticed in the engine. I've actually encountered quite a few more problems, and while I won't list all of them here, let's quickly run through a few more annoyances just to get it out of my system. Godot's user interface utilizes a single main panel that renders the 2D scene, 3D scene, or the script editor. It was probably easier for people implementing the UI to do it this way, and I've heard that it has stayed this way due to performance concerns. But I do think this approach is going to feel very limited in the long term. Godot would really benefit from following the standards of any other software by letting every panel exist in an arbitrary position. In other words, full UI customization. Regardless of the performance concerns, I think we should at least make the jump away from main panels to set up the codebase for the future, because it's only going to get more complicated to change it as more features are added to the program. I can work with the UI layout as it is now, but I can easily see this becoming an issue as it gets more complicated. Having some sort of save load layout feature would really open up a lot of possibilities, like having 2D and 3D scenes side by side to work on UI within a 3D game, or being able to code while previewing a scene. Next up, there used to be very limited customization of the 3D controls. That is to say, you could only move the camera around a 3D scene according to specific preset styles that were hard-coded in the editor. However, while writing the script for this video, Godot maintainers merged my pull request, which opened up full customization of the navigation controls, and that'll be available in version 4.4. Thank you so much for that. I guess we can move on to the next thing. Finally, when it comes to creating packages, there is a bit of confusion between add-ons and plugins within the community. The two terms are often used interchangeably, but from what I understand, a plugin has a config file and an add-on does not. I believe we need to unify these two concepts into one universal Godot package, and we need to be able to install them more easily from sources besides the asset library. For example, it would be really nice to install a package from a Git URL, as it would open up the door to load in private packages without going through manual cloning steps. I'm currently working on an extension that hopes to add this functionality to Godot projects. For the package ecosystem to thrive, I also strongly believe that we need dependencies. That is to say, we should allow a plugin to rely on another plugin, and have each element in the chain update when necessary to allow new plugins to work correctly. In other words, we need something like NPM for Godot. Now, some of you just cringed, but honestly, there are a ton of benefits to community content backed with the feature set of a package manager. Now, there are already a few Godot package managers, but they can be complicated to use or rely on external tools. like this one that relies on npm itself. But when it's tied to an external registry like this, we hit a wall if we want to use private packages and end up spending $7 a month for an npm account. Ouch. It sure would be nice if Godot's plugin configuration supported dependencies and allowed us to install from more sources so the engine itself can manage all the complicated package stuff that we as developers shouldn't have to deal with. Okay, well that was a lot. Might have been hard to follow, but I think it was worth it to discuss this stuff properly in a video. I hope it doesn't seem like I'm bad-mouthing Godot or downplaying the incredible work that the contributors have done, because that is not my intention. I just want to highlight the fact that Godot isn't perfect. No engine is, and while it's good to be optimistic about it, it's also reasonable to expect that not everyone can live with the drawbacks for the time being. I say this mainly to dissuade the idea that it's always easy to switch technologies. For certain types of developers, it most definitely is not. For people who make complex 3D games like I do, with tons of level geometry, music, animations, and sequencing systems built over many months of hard work, these limitations can and will add up to additional dev time. I'm of the opinion that Godot is in need of some crucial improvements to be able to compete with the workflow of Unity and Unreal. And yes, I do believe that Godot should try to compete in that space. While it may never offer the same high-end graphics features or streamlined production process, the way that you work with those engines is so standardized that developers will expect Godot to work similarly. I believe it should cater to developers who want to build massive open-world games just as much as it should cater to small indie platformers. That is how the engine can grow and evolve to something greater. Personally, I've been less frustrated with the lack of engine features and more so with the fact that sometimes the Godot community can be reluctant to change in the first place. Godot is always evolving, and while it's good to stay true to the core philosophy, I also believe it is our duty to continuously challenge that philosophy and unlock new ways of building games, because there are always improvements to be made. I've been working hard to discover workflows that work well for my projects, and have spent a lot of time being distracted from actual game development, because I'm trying to create a smoother experience for using Godot in the future. But even after going through the trouble of researching and programming and creating documentation for all my changes, pull requests can still be stuck in limbo, or just outright rejected, even if they have a massive amount of support. And I don't blame the maintainers for this, because I know that in a big project, you want to be careful about what goes into the program. But I hope that we as a community can open up to the potential of the engine and are willing to push the boundaries in order to stay relevant in the game tech sphere. I also want to keep up good communication between engine developers and engine users so we can avoid long stalls in certain features and find reasonable workflows together. Beyond the issue of it just taking a long time to develop and merge critical features, I want to be sure that we head in a direction that both makes life easier for people who use Godot and brings us closer to the standards we expect from other engines. I've heard many times that Godot is not Unity, but that doesn't mean that we have to actively avoid concepts that Unity utilizes if they work. And sometimes I believe it's better to mirror what other engines do, because it allows for a smoother transition when people migrate from those engines and leads to more people investing in Godot. So in the absence of some of these time-saving and debugging features that are critical to the way I develop games, my only option might be to roll out my own fork of Godot and use that for my games. It really truly sucks to have to go that route because it is a lot of work to maintain, and that kind of split can get messy very fast. And not to mention if I rely on this fork and on certain features that are never merged into regular Godot, my projects will always be tied to the fork and won't be able to return. This means I won't get bug fixes until I update my fork, and I'll have to manually manage sometimes very complicated changes within the engine and port my updates forward. And all this just takes away from actual development time. The common sentiment is to either just accept the limitations of the engine and not worry about the differences in workflow, or just keep using a different engine. And that's fair, and for some people, this is probably the best way to approach this problem. But Unity has issues of its own that are solved by switching to Godot, and I have big plans. I want to create tons of games in the future, and I need an extremely solid foundation to keep my modules and codebase intact for the long term. These are complicated games with many moving parts, and my ultimate goal is to achieve AAA quality output with an indie toolset, and that requires a scalable and modular process that is also customizable for a wide variety of games. A lofty ideal for sure, but isn't that not too different from trying to make a game in the first place? Isn't that why we choose Godot at all? Game developers should want to put out the best possible games while making the production process as smooth as possible. And that's exactly why I believe highlighting these issues will contribute to that goal. So unless I accept drastic changes to my workflow, there are 3 options ahead of me. I could either continue waiting and contributing to Godot's main branch until it can handle my process, take a shortcut by building a fork, which adapts my old workflow, or just stick with Unity. All these options have downsides, but with the first 2, I can see them eating up so much extra development time that I start to second guess why I'm even considering Godot in the first place. There are countless little feature deficiencies I've come across, from IK systems to physics, which do make me worry that all these little differences could add up to a truly unreasonable time developing in Godot. And right now I'm not sure if I can justify that, and I already struggle so much just making a game in the first place. That's why I've been biding my time and working with the engine I know until things improve down the line. However, with the pace of Godot development, I do worry that it might take years to fully transition seamlessly from what I'm used to. I still have high hopes for what it can become, and my eagerness to be free of closed source software keeps dragging me back into PRs and extensions for the engine. But sometimes it truly has been dreadful and soul-crushing going through all of these extra steps to replicate my workflow. I'm well aware that my experience with Unity has biased me towards a specific way of making games, but I honestly did not expect to run into this many issues with just a simple test project. I'm sure that plenty of people can live without this stuff, but it seems to me that the bigger your project is, the more these problems become apparent. And compared to some of the beginner projects I see in Godot communities, my games are absolutely massive in scope. I know that I will encounter issues on a whole different level than these types of games, so before I dive headfirst into a big project, I want to be absolutely sure that I can work the way that I'm used to. After all, if it takes over a year to create one of my games, I really need to minimize the amount of frustration, and having a comfortable environment is the best way to accomplish that. So what is my takeaway from thinking about all of this? I think in the meantime, I'm going to do my best to contribute to the engine and get closer to addressing these problems with pull requests and idea discussion. Some of these issues are definitely above my abilities as a programmer, at least currently, as I haven't learned every corner of the codebase yet, but somehow I always surprise myself at how much I'm able to do. While writing this video, 4.3 has been released, and it is a huge step forward, but there's still ways to go before I can feel confident working with it. 4.4 is on the way, and with some luck, we may reach a point soon where all of these issues are addressed and behind us. So if that day comes, you can be sure that I'll be attempting to build my next game in the Godot engine. That's all I wanted to mention today, so thank you very much for watching, and I will again say that Godot is awesome and you should go support it. There will be a link to the Godot Foundation in the description, and they always appreciate donations or code contributions in order to keep development going. I hope after all this, you've at least had some sort of understanding of the problems I've faced and know why I've been struggling a bit with this technology. I realize this is a highly opinionated subject, and if you're happy with Godot the way it is, that's totally fine. I only wanted to share my perspective and hope you can remain open-minded to these sorts of improvements that would make my life easier. So let's work together to make Godot a better experience for everyone. I don't know where my work will ultimately thrive in the future, but I will still do everything I can to bridge the gap from the engines I already know, and hope that we can all create awesome games with powerful open source technology. The first step to creating improvements that elevate Godot is to gather, share, and discuss ideas that make developers' lives easier. So feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, and as always, thanks for playing.